Hello, I'm Maria Santos. For 3 years, they watched me scrub their toilets, vacuum their offices, and empty their trash cans, while they cracked jokes about the help not understanding their important business discussions. They called me the cleaning lady, the maid, sometimes just, hey you, when they needed something. What they didn't know was that every paycheck they deposited, every promotion they celebrated, every executive decision they made, happened because I owned the company they worked for. The day I walked into their board meeting and fired half the executive team, that was just the beginning of what they never saw coming. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. But before I tell you how I brought their world crashing down, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from tonight? And, more importantly, have you ever been invisible to people who should have seen you? Have you ever been underestimated so completely that it became your greatest weapon? Because what happened in that boardroom wasn't just about business. It was about every person who's ever been looked through instead of looked at. Every person who's been judged by their uniform instead of their mind. Every person who's been dismissed because someone else decided their story for them. You see, I didn't plan for my life to unfold this way. When I came back from my second deployment in Afghanistan, I had a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a head full of strategies that had kept my unit alive through some of the worst combat zones in Helmand Province. I also had a college degree in business administration that I'd earned through night classes between missions, correspondence courses during downtime, and sheer determination to build something meaningful when I got home. The plan was simple: use my GI Bill benefits, get my MBA, start my own logistics company. I'd seen enough supply chain disasters overseas to know I could do better. But plans change when you're a female veteran with PTSD, trying to find your footing in a world that doesn't quite know what to do with you. The nightmares came first, then the hypervigilance, then the slowly dawning realization that civilian employers looked at my military service and saw either a liability or a novelty, never just competence. Interview after interview, I watched their faces change when they learned about my combat experience. Too intense, they'd think. Too rigid. Not a cultural fit. The rejection letters piled up like body counts I was trying to forget. So I took what I could get. American Dynamics Corporation was hiring for janitorial services through a contracting company. Night shift, minimal human interaction, steady pay. It wasn't what I'd planned, but it was honest work, and after months of rejection, honest work felt like salvation. I figured it would be temporary, just until I could get back on my feet and figure out my next move. I had no idea I was walking into a 3-year masterclass in corporate dysfunction, or that I was about to discover exactly how much power invisibility could give you. The first thing you learn as cleaning staff is that you become part of the furniture. People talk around you like you're not there, leave sensitive documents on their desks, have phone conversations about mergers and acquisitions while you're emptying their wastebaskets. They assume you don't understand, don't care, or don't matter enough to be a security risk. In their minds, you're just the help. Your background noise in their important lives. But I wasn't just any janitor. I was a former intelligence analyst who'd spent 2 years intercepting enemy communications and identifying patterns that saved lives. I was someone who'd coordinated supply chains across 3 provinces under rocket fire. I was a business student who'd written my senior thesis on mid-market acquisition strategies. And now I was invisible, in the middle of a company that was hemorrhaging money due to the exact inefficiencies I'd been trained to spot. American Dynamics was a logistics and supply chain management firm that serviced mid-sized manufacturing companies across the Southeast. On paper, they looked successful. In reality, they were a case study in how not to run a business. I watched their operations for months, listening to conference calls through thin walls, reading email printouts left in trash cans, observing their decision-making processes during late-night cleaning rounds. They were burning through cash on redundant systems, losing clients due to delayed shipments, and managed by executives who seemed more interested in their golf handicaps than their profit margins. The CEO, Richard Blackstone, was a good old boy who'd inherited his position through family connections and treated the business like his personal piggy bank. His son, Marcus, was being groomed for upper management despite having the strategic thinking skills of a caffeinated squirrel. The CFO, Helena Morrison, was sharp enough to see the problems, but too politically careful to challenge the boys' club that ran things. The whole operation was a powder keg waiting for someone with actual competence to light the fuse. That someone, it turned out, was me, but not in the way anyone expected. 3 months into my janitorial job, I was cleaning the CFO's office when I noticed a folder marked Acquisition Opportunities sitting open on her desk. Inside were profiles of smaller logistics companies that American Dynamics was considering buying. The numbers told a story. These smaller firms were outperforming American Dynamics in every metric that mattered: efficiency, client retention, profit margins, growth potential. American Dynamics wasn't looking to buy companies to expand their capabilities. They were looking to buy their way out of their own incompetence. That's when the idea hit me. If American Dynamics was shopping for solutions, maybe I could provide one. Not as Maria Santos, the janitor, but as MS Enterprises, a consulting firm that specialized in logistics optimization for mid-market companies. I could offer them exactly what they needed: someone who understood their problems from the inside and had the skills to fix them. The beauty was that they'd never connect the woman who emptied their trash cans with the consultant who could save their company. I spent the next 6 months building MS Enterprises from my studio apartment. Nights were for cleaning American Dynamics offices and gathering intelligence. Days were for developing business proposals, creating logistics software, and establishing relationships with their suppliers and clients. I used my military contacts to build a network of freelance consultants, former service members who understood operations and weren't afraid of hard work. I leveraged my security clearance to land contracts with defense contractors who needed supply chain management. Slowly, quietly, I built something real. The breakthrough came when one of American Dynamics' biggest clients, a manufacturing company that produced automotive parts, started having serious supply chain issues. Late deliveries, quality control problems, inventory management disasters. I watched Blackstone and his team fumble the response for weeks, making the problems worse with every decision. The client was furious, threatening to take their business elsewhere. American Dynamics was about to lose a 7-figure contract because they couldn't organize a supply chain that any competent logistics professional could have fixed in a week. So MS Enterprises reached out to the manufacturing company directly, not to steal the business, just to solve the problem. I presented them with a comprehensive analysis of their supply chain issues and a detailed plan to fix them. The plan worked flawlessly. Within a month, their efficiency was up 30%, their costs were down 20%, and their client satisfaction scores were the highest they'd been in 5 years. They were so impressed that they recommended MS Enterprises to other companies in their network. Word spreads fast in industry circles when someone delivers results like that. Within 6 months, MS Enterprises had a client roster that included some of the most successful manufacturing companies in the region. Companies that had heard about this mysterious consulting firm that could solve logistics problems other people couldn't even identify. Companies that, coincidentally, were exactly the kind of clients American Dynamics was desperately trying to attract. But here's the part that still makes me smile when I think about it. Every night, I'd go to work at American Dynamics, put on my uniform, and clean the offices of people who were slowly watching their business model become obsolete. I'd empty the trash cans of executives who were losing clients to solutions I'd designed. I'd vacuum the conference rooms where they held emergency meetings about competitors they couldn't identify, problems they couldn't solve, and a future they couldn't see coming. And through it all, I remained invisible, just the cleaning lady who showed up after hours, did her job quietly, and left before the important people arrived. They never asked my name, never wondered about my background, never considered that the woman wiping down their whiteboards might understand their business better than they did. In their world, people like me didn't have opinions that mattered, ideas worth hearing, or capabilities worth recognizing. That invisibility became my superpower. While they saw a janitor, I was building an empire. While they dismissed me as irrelevant, I was becoming indispensable to their industry. While they looked through me, I was watching them, learning their weaknesses, and positioning myself to do what they never thought possible. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have revealed yourself sooner, tried to work within their system, given them a chance to see you differently? Or would you have done what I did? Let them show you exactly who they were when they thought no one was watching, then used that knowledge to rewrite the rules entirely. Because what happened next changed everything. Not just for American dynamics, but for every person who's ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off by people who should have known better. The reveal was coming, and it was going to be brutal. Every Monday morning, I'd arrive at American Dynamics at 6 p.m. sharp, just as the last of the day shift employees were heading to the parking garage. I'd badge in through the service entrance using my cleaning contractor ID, wheel my cart through the maze of cubicles, and begin what everyone assumed was mindless janitorial work. What they didn't realize was that I was walking through my laboratory, observing the daily failures of a company that should have been thriving but was instead slowly bleeding to death from 1,000 small cuts of incompetence. The executive floor was where the real theater played out. Richard Blackstone's corner office was a monument to inherited privilege, mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, oil paintings of hunting scenes, a wet bar that saw more action than his strategic planning sessions. His son Marcus had claimed the office next door, decorating it with his fraternity composite photos and a putting green that he used during conference calls. Helena Morrison, the CFO, kept her space Spartanly professional, but I could see the stress in how she organized her files, the way important documents were buried under less critical paperwork, as if she was trying to hide the company's problems from herself. During my first week, I learned their evening routine. Blackstone would leave around 4:30 for his standing golf game, making jokes to his assistant about letting the worker bees finish up the hive. Marcus would stick around until 5 o'clock, mostly playing games on his computer and video chatting with his girlfriend about weekend plans in Hilton Head. Morrison would be the last executive to leave, usually around 6:15, her briefcase stuffed with work she'd tackle from home because the office environment was too chaotic for actual productivity. The rank-and-file employees had a different energy entirely. These were competent people trapped in an incompetent system, and you could see the frustration in their body language, hear it in their hushed conversations, feel it in the resignation that hung over the cubicle farm like morning fog. Jenny Walsh, a logistics coordinator with 15 years of experience, would stay late trying to untangle supply chain knots that proper planning could have prevented. David Chen, an operations analyst, had developed solutions to recurring problems that his supervisors consistently ignored or misunderstood. Sarah Martinez, a client relations manager, spent most of her time apologizing for delays and mistakes that better management could have avoided entirely. These were the people doing the real work, the ones keeping American Dynamics afloat despite leadership that seemed actively committed to sinking the ship. And they were the ones who noticed me first. Not as a person exactly, but as a presence. Jenny would nod when I emptied her wastebasket. David would say thank you when I restocked the supply closet. Sarah would offer me coffee from the break room pot when she worked late. Small gestures, but they revealed something important. These people understood what it meant to be invisible, to do essential work that goes unrecognized. The executives, by contrast, treated me like animated furniture. Blackstone would continue phone conversations about confidential business matters while I vacuumed around his desk, discussing acquisition targets and financial projections as if I was deaf and mute. Marcus would literally step over my cleaning supplies without acknowledging my existence, sometimes kicking them aside if they interfered with his path to the elevator. Morrison was more polite but equally dismissive. She'd move papers out of my way and give me tight smiles that said, "I see you're there, but you're not really there." One particular evening crystallized the dynamic perfectly. I was cleaning the conference room after a late executive meeting, emptying ashtrays and wiping down the whiteboard where they'd been discussing quarterly projections. The numbers were still visible. Revenue targets they had no realistic plan to hit, cost reduction goals that ignored operational realities, market share assumptions that bordered on fantasy. Blackstone and Marcus were in the hallway just outside, voices carrying through the partially open door. "The problem," Blackstone was saying, "is that these people don't understand vision. They're focused on day-to-day operational nonsense instead of seeing the big picture. That's why we need leadership that can think strategically." Marcus agreed enthusiastically. "Exactly, Dad. Like Jenny keeps sending these detailed reports about supply chain inefficiencies. But she doesn't get that we're building toward a major acquisition. Why optimize current operations when we're going to completely restructure everything anyway? Right. And David's always pushing these technology solutions that would require significant investment. He doesn't understand that we need to preserve capital for growth opportunities. Sometimes you have to ignore the worker bee mentality and focus on queen bee decisions. I continued cleaning, making no indication that I was listening, but internally I was cataloging every word. They were dismissing their most competent employees as lacking vision, while pursuing a growth strategy that ignored fundamental operational realities. They were planning acquisitions to solve problems that better management could fix internally. They were so convinced of their own strategic superiority that they couldn't see they were the primary obstacle to their company's success. The irony was staggering. While they talked about vision and strategy, I was literally looking at evidence of their failures written on the whiteboard in front of me. While they dismissed their employees' operational expertise, I was observing firsthand how their leadership decisions created the problems their workers were desperately trying to solve. While they planned to buy their way out of incompetence, I was building a business model that proved their assumptions wrong. But the real revelation came during my third month when I discovered exactly how they talked about people like me when they thought no one was listening. I was restocking supplies in the executive break room when Morrison and Marcus came in for coffee, continuing a conversation they'd started elsewhere. "I just think we need to be more careful about information security," Morrison was saying. "Some of these cleaning people have been here for years. They hear things." Marcus laughed dismissively. "Helena, they're janitors. They don't speak the language of business. Most of them probably don't even have high school diplomas. You really think the woman who mops our floors is going to understand competitive intelligence or acquisition strategies? I'm not saying they'd understand the implications, but they could repeat things to the wrong people. Industrial espionage is a real concern in our industry. Look, these people are invisible for a reason. They don't exist in our world. They show up, clean our messes, and disappear. It's not like they're going home to network with our competitors or start their own consulting firms. They're cleaning ladies and janitors because that's their ceiling. If they had the capability to do more, they'd be doing more." Morrison seemed satisfied with this logic, and they moved on to discussing weekend plans. But I stood there in the supply closet, hidden behind industrial-sized paper towel packages, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, though that was part of it. Not hurt, though I felt that too. What I felt was clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about exactly who these people were when they thought no one was watching. They hadn't just dismissed me as irrelevant. They'd constructed an entire worldview that made my irrelevance not just convenient but inevitable. In their minds, people like me were invisible because we deserved to be invisible. We were cleaning their offices because we lacked the intelligence, education, or capability to do anything else. Our circumstances weren't the result of complex economic factors, personal challenges, or systemic barriers. They were simply the natural order of things, with them at the top and us at the bottom, each in our proper place. This wasn't casual classism or unconscious bias. This was a deliberate philosophy that justified their superiority by defining my inferiority. And the most dangerous part was how completely they believed it. They weren't just pretending I didn't matter. They genuinely couldn't conceive of a world where I might. The next morning, I sat in my apartment and opened my laptop to check on MS Enterprises. 3 new client inquiries had come in overnight, including one from a manufacturing company that was currently spending 6 figures annually with American Dynamics for logistics services they weren't satisfied with. Another was from a regional supplier that American Dynamics had been courting unsuccessfully for 2 years. The third was from a private equity firm looking for operational consulting on a logistics company they were considering acquiring, a company that competed directly with American Dynamics in 2 key markets. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about Marcus's words. If they had the capability to do more, they'd be doing more. He was right, in a way. I did have the capability to do more. I was doing more. I was building something that would soon make their entire operation obsolete, and they were paying me to watch it happen from the inside. But capability wasn't the same as visibility. I was proving every day that their assumptions about people like me were catastrophically wrong. But they couldn't see the proof because they'd already decided what was possible. They'd created a reality where my success was literally invisible to them, not because it didn't exist, but because acknowledging it would require them to question everything they believed about themselves and their world. That realization changed my strategy. I wasn't just building a business anymore, I was building a reckoning. Every night I cleaned their offices, I was gathering intelligence about people who had made their contempt for me into an operating principle. Every day I grew MS enterprises. I was proving that their entire worldview was built on a foundation of sand. And when the time came to reveal the truth, it wouldn't just be a business decision. It would be an education about the dangerous assumptions people make when they think no one worth worrying about is watching. What Richard Blackstone Marcus and Helena Morrison didn't know was that while I was emptying their trash cans and wiping down their conference tables, I was simultaneously running a logistics consulting firm that was quietly revolutionizing supply chain management across the Southeast. MS Enterprises weren't just successful, it was becoming the ghost that haunted their industry, the mysterious competitor they couldn't identify but couldn't ignore. Every morning after my night shift at American Dynamics, I'd drive home to my modest apartment in Virginia Highland, shower off the scent of industrial cleaner, and transform into someone they would never recognize. Gone was Maria the janitor in her blue uniform and sensible shoes. In her place was MS Enterprises founder and CEO, conducting video conferences with manufacturing executives, reviewing operational assessments, and implementing supply chain solutions that were setting new industry standards. My home office was a study in contrast. One wall held my military commendations, the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Badge that represented my service in Afghanistan. Another wall displayed my business degree and logistics certifications, credentials that would have impressed American Dynamics leadership if they'd bothered to learn anything about the woman who cleaned their offices. But the real power was in the technology setup. 3 monitors displaying real-time supply chain data from clients across the region, secure communication systems for coordination with my network of veteran consultants, and proprietary software I developed that could optimize logistics operations in ways American Dynamics couldn't imagine. The software was my secret weapon, born from a combination of military intelligence training and business school theory. During my deployments, I'd learned to track supply lines under combat conditions, identifying vulnerabilities and inefficiencies that could mean the difference between mission success and casualties. Those same analytical skills, applied to civilian logistics, created solutions that were both more efficient and more resilient than anything American Dynamics offered their clients. My first major success came through a manufacturing company called Piedmont Industrial, which produced precision components for aerospace applications. They'd been struggling with inventory management issues that were costing them hundreds of thousands in rush orders and expedited shipping. American Dynamics had pitched them a traditional logistics package, basically the same cookie-cutter approach they offered everyone, but Piedmont's CEO was smart enough to recognize that his problems required custom solutions. That's when MS Enterprises entered the picture. I spent 2 weeks analyzing Piedmont's operations, not from a conference room but from their factory floor, watching how materials moved, where bottlenecks formed, and how their existing systems created unnecessary complexity. My military experience had taught me that the best intelligence comes from direct observation, not PowerPoint presentations in climate-controlled offices. The solution I designed for Piedmont wasn't just logistics consulting. It was supply chain architecture. Instead of simply managing their existing inefficiencies more efficiently, I rebuilt their entire approach to inventory management, supplier relationships, and production scheduling. The results were immediate and dramatic: a 40% reduction in inventory carrying costs, 95% on-time delivery rates, and supply chain visibility that let them anticipate problems weeks before they materialized. Piedmont's CEO was so impressed that he started recommending MS Enterprises to other manufacturers in his network. Word spread through industry associations, executive golf games, and the informal networks that connected successful business leaders. Within 6 months, I had clients in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee, many of them companies that American Dynamics had been trying to land for years. The beautiful irony was that several of these clients were actively looking to replace American Dynamics when they found MS Enterprises. Coastal Manufacturing had terminated their contract after a series of delivery failures. Atlantic Components was frustrated with American Dynamics' inability to adapt their services to changing market conditions. Southeastern Logistics Solutions, a mid-sized firm that American Dynamics had tried to acquire, was considering switching service providers because they needed more sophisticated supply chain analytics. Meanwhile, every night I cleaned the offices where Blackstone, Marcus, and Morrison struggled to understand why their business was stagnating. I'd listen to their conference calls through thin walls as they discussed client defections, failed sales pitches, and the mysterious consulting firm that seemed to be solving problems they couldn't even identify properly. They knew something was changing in their industry, but they couldn't figure out what. The closest they came to the truth was during a heated executive meeting I overheard, while cleaning the conference room next door. Morrison was presenting quarterly results that showed declining market share and client satisfaction scores, while new competitors were gaining ground with approaches American Dynamics couldn't match. "There's definitely consolidation happening," she told Blackstone and Marcus. "Smaller players are finding ways to compete more effectively, and some of our long-term clients are switching to boutique firms that offer more specialized services." Blackstone's response was predictably dismissive. "These are fad strategies, Helena. Clients always chase the latest shiny object, but they come back to established providers when they realize boutique firms can't scale. We just need to wait out this market correction." Marcus nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Plus, most of these new firms are probably operating on venture capital money or unsustainable pricing models. Once their initial funding runs out, they'll disappear or get absorbed by companies like us that have real staying power." I had to suppress a laugh as I wiped down the whiteboard where they'd mapped out their quote-quote competitive landscape. MS Enterprises was listed under unknown/miscellaneous threats with a question mark next to it. They'd identified my company as a concern but couldn't figure out who was behind it, how we operated, or why we were so effective. To them, we were just another mysterious competitor in an increasingly crowded market. What they didn't realize was that MS Enterprises weren't operating on venture capital or unsustainable pricing. We were profitable from day one because our overhead was minimal, our expertise was unmatched, and our approach was fundamentally different from traditional logistics consulting. Instead of selling standardized solutions to standardized problems, we created custom architectures that transformed how our clients thought about supply chain management. The veteran network I'd built was crucial to this success. My core team consisted of former military personnel who understood operations, logistics, and mission-critical thinking in ways that civilian consultants couldn't match. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, who'd managed supply lines across 3 combat zones, became my director of client operations. Sergeant First Class James Thompson, a former intelligence analyst, headed our data analytics division. Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Vasquez, who'd coordinated humanitarian logistics in disaster zones, led our crisis management consulting practice. Together, we brought a military precision to civilian logistics that was revolutionizing how our clients operated. We didn't just solve problems, we anticipated them. We didn't just optimize existing systems, we redesigned them from the ground up. We didn't just provide consulting, we delivered results that transformed businesses. But the most satisfying part was watching American Dynamics leadership struggle to understand what was happening to their industry, while I literally had a front row seat to their confusion. Every night, I'd clean the offices where they held crisis meetings about declining performance. Every day, I'd implement solutions for their former clients that demonstrated exactly why American Dynamics was failing. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. They were losing market share to competitors they couldn't identify, watching clients defect to solutions they couldn't understand, and struggling with operational challenges that they couldn't solve. Meanwhile, the woman they paid to empty their trash cans was quietly building the very thing that was making their business model obsolete. Sometimes I'd find documents in their waste baskets that revealed just how completely they misunderstood their situation. Internal memos about market volatility and unrealistic client expectations. Strategy papers that recommended doubling down on approaches that were already failing. Acquisition proposals for companies that were thriving specifically because they'd rejected American Dynamics' model in favor of approaches like mine. The disconnect was so complete that it felt like watching a slow-motion disaster from two different perspectives simultaneously. During my night shifts, I was Maria Santos, the invisible janitor who witnessed their meetings, read their documents, and observed their decision-making processes. During my day shifts, I was the founder of MS Enterprises, implementing strategies that were systematically dismantling everything they thought they knew about logistics consulting. They were living in a reality where people like me didn't exist as competitors, only as support staff. Where military veterans were seen as good for entry-level positions but not executive leadership. Where women could be efficient assistants but not strategic visionaries. Where working-class backgrounds indicated limited potential rather than different perspectives. That reality was about to collide with the truth in ways they couldn't imagine, because while they saw a janitor, I was building an empire. While they dismissed my capabilities, I was proving them catastrophically wrong. While they assumed their superiority was natural and permanent, I was preparing to demonstrate just how quickly assumptions can become liabilities. The question wasn't whether they'd eventually discover who was behind MS Enterprises. The question was what would happen when they realized that the woman they'd been looking through for 3 years had been looking right back at them, and building something that would change everything they thought they understood about power, competence, and who gets to matter in their world. The path that led me to mopping floors at American Dynamics while secretly building their competition began 7 years earlier, in a forward operating base outside Kandahar, where I was managing supply lines that kept 3,000 soldiers fed, armed, and equipped, under conditions that would have broken most corporate logistics systems in hours. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, that was my rank then, had a reputation for making the impossible routine. When insurgent attacks cut our primary supply route for 6 days, I reorganized our entire distribution network, using secondary roads, helicopter drops, and coordination with Afghan local police units that most logistics coordinators wouldn't have trusted with a coffee order. When a sandstorm grounded aircraft for 3 days during a critical resupply mission, I negotiated with local tribal leaders to establish temporary waypoints that kept essential supplies moving through conditions that satellite imagery couldn't penetrate. The skills I developed in those mountains weren't the kind they teach in business school. I learned to read situations where incomplete information was the norm, not the exception. I learned to build systems that functioned under pressure, adapted to changing conditions, and prioritized mission success over procedural compliance. Most importantly, I learned that the difference between life and death often came down to understanding what really mattered versus what people said mattered. My commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, recognized something in my approach that went beyond standard military logistics. During my final deployment evaluation, she pulled me aside and said something I'd never forgotten. "Santos, you don't just manage supply chains. You see them. You understand how systems work at a level that most people never reach. When you get back to the civilian world, don't let anyone convince you that your perspective isn't valuable just because you learned it in uniform." She was right about my perspective, but wrong about how the civilian world would receive it. When I returned from Afghanistan with my military decorations and a business degree I'd completed through correspondence courses during deployment downtime, I discovered that employers saw my military service as either a liability or a curiosity, never as a qualification. The same analytical skills that had kept supply lines functioning under rocket fire were somehow irrelevant to civilian logistics challenges that were objectively simpler, but politically more complex. The interviews were educational in ways I hadn't expected. At corporate consulting firms, they'd nod politely when I described optimizing supply chains under combat conditions, then ask whether I'd be comfortable in collaborative environments or could adapt to civilian workplace culture. At logistics companies, they'd express admiration for my service, then explain that their clients expected consultants with traditional business backgrounds, not military experience. At manufacturing firms, they'd thank me for my service, then suggest I might be happier in operations roles rather than strategic positions. The subtext was always the same. Your experience is impressive, but it's not our kind of experience. Your skills are valuable, but not for this position. Your background is interesting, but we're looking for someone who fits our culture. Culture, I learned, was code for people who looked like their existing leadership, talked like their existing leadership, and came from the same educational and professional backgrounds as their existing leadership. After 8 months of polite rejections and suggestions that I consider transitional positions in administration or customer service, I was running low on savings and running out of optimism. The PTSD wasn't helping. Nightmares that left me exhausted, hypervigilance that made normal social interactions feel like tactical exercises, and a growing sense that the country I'd served overseas didn't have a place for people like me back home. That's when I saw the posting for janitorial services at American Dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was applying to clean offices in a building full of people doing work I was overqualified to supervise, but I needed steady income, health insurance, and time to figure out my next move. The night shift meant minimal human interaction, which appealed to someone who was still adjusting to civilian noise levels and social expectations. The hiring process was refreshingly straightforward. No questions about cultural fit, no concerns about my military background being too intense for their environment. Just a background check, a drug test, and a uniform fitting. For the first time in months, someone wanted to hire me based on my ability to do the job rather than my ability to conform to their preconceptions about who belonged in their workplace. My supervisor was a woman named Patricia Gonzalez, who'd been cleaning office buildings for 15 years, and understood that good janitorial work required attention to detail, reliability, and the ability to be thorough without being intrusive. She taught me the rhythms of American Dynamics, which executives stayed late, which departments generated the most trash, which conference rooms needed special attention after client meetings. The key, Patricia explained during my first week, is to be invisible but observant. These people need us, but they don't want to think about us. You do good work, you keep your ears open for anything that might affect building security, and you stay out of their important business. They'll treat you like furniture. Which isn't personal, that's just how it works. She was right about being treated like furniture, but wrong about staying out of their business. Within my first month, I realized that my military intelligence training made it impossible to ignore the operational disasters unfolding around me. Every night, I'd clean conference rooms where strategic planning sessions had devolved into finger-pointing exercises. I'd empty trash cans filled with printouts showing supply chain failures that proper coordination could have prevented. I'd vacuum around whiteboards covered with problem-solving attempts that ignored fundamental logistics principles I'd learned as a staff sergeant. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were people who controlled millions of dollars in resources, managed relationships with Fortune 500 clients, and made decisions that affected thousands of jobs. But their approach to the very problems I'd solved under combat conditions was so fundamentally flawed that I found myself mentally redesigning their systems while I restocked their supply closets. American Dynamics wasn't just inefficient, it was incompetently managed by people who'd never been tested under real pressure. Blackstone had inherited his position through family, connections, and treated the business like a hobby that happened to generate income. Marcus was being groomed for leadership based on his last name, rather than any demonstrated competence. Even Morrison, who was clearly the most capable executive, seemed trapped by a corporate culture that prioritized politics over performance. The contrast with military logistics was stark. In Afghanistan, if your supply chain failed, people died. If your coordination broke down, missions failed. If your leadership was incompetent, careers ended and lives were lost. There was no room for nepotism, no tolerance for ego-driven decision-making, no patience for strategies that sounded good in conference rooms but fell apart under operational pressure. But in American Dynamics' civilian world, failure seemed to have few consequences. Missed deadlines meant revised timelines. Client dissatisfaction meant discount pricing. Operational inefficiencies meant higher costs that got passed along to customers. The feedback loops that forced competence in military settings simply didn't exist in their corporate environment. That realization sparked something that had been dormant since my return from deployment, the entrepreneurial instinct that had driven me to complete my business degree during combat tours. If American Dynamics could survive despite fundamental operational failures, what could someone with actual logistics expertise accomplish in the same market? If their clients were dissatisfied with services that barely met minimum standards, how would they respond to solutions that exceeded their expectations? The idea for MS Enterprises began forming during those first months of night shifts, as I observed their failures and imagined alternatives. But the real catalyst came 6 months into my janitorial job, when I witnessed a client meeting that crystallized everything wrong with their approach to business. Piedmont Industrial's CEO had come to American Dynamics to discuss serious supply chain problems that were threatening a major aerospace contract. The meeting lasted 3 hours, during which Blackstone and Marcus offered increasingly desperate variations of the same inadequate solutions. I watched through the conference room's glass wall as the client's frustration mounted, and American Dynamics leadership struggled to understand problems they'd never actually solved. After the client left, clearly unsatisfied and likely shopping for alternatives, I found myself staring at the whiteboard where they'd mapped out Piedmont's supply chain challenges. Every problem they'd identified had military logistics parallels. Every solution they'd dismissed as too complex had combat-tested applications. Every concern they'd minimized as unrealistic had straightforward operational fixes. That night, instead of going home to my apartment, I drove to an all-night diner and spent 4 hours sketching out a complete redesign of Piedmont's logistics architecture. Not because I planned to do anything with it, but because I couldn't stop my mind from solving problems that American Dynamics had given up on. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its effectiveness, and completely achievable with existing technology and standard industry practices. It addressed every concern Piedmont's CEO had raised, anticipated problems American Dynamics hadn't even identified, and created efficiencies that would transform their competitive position in the aerospace market. Sitting in that diner booth at 3 a.m, surrounded by coffee cups and napkins covered with supply chain diagrams, I realized that Colonel Hayes had been right about my perspective being valuable. But she'd been wrong about one thing. I didn't need to wait for the civilian world to recognize that value. I could create my own world where competence mattered more than connections, where results spoke louder than resumes, and where the skills I'd developed in uniform finally found the recognition they deserved. MS Enterprises was born that night not as a business plan but as a promise to myself that I'd never again accept other people's limitations on what I could accomplish. The pattern of dismissal at American Dynamics wasn't subtle, it was systematic, deliberate, and so deeply ingrained in their corporate culture that they practiced it without conscious thought. Every interaction reinforced the same hierarchy: executives who mattered, employees who served, and service staff who existed in a category so far below relevance that acknowledging our humanity seemed optional. Tuesday evenings were particularly revealing because that's when Blackstone held his informal leadership meetings in the executive conference room. These weren't official board meetings or client presentations. They were strategy sessions where the real decisions got made, where policies were shaped, and where the company's future direction was determined by people who'd never questioned their right to determine it. I'd be cleaning the adjacent break room during these sessions, close enough to hear every word through walls that were more decorative than soundproof. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Blackstone would pontificate about vision and market positioning, while Marcus nodded enthusiastically and offered variations of his father's ideas as if they were original insights. Morrison would present data and analysis that usually got dismissed if it contradicted their preconceptions about how business should work. During one particularly memorable session, they were discussing employee retention issues that had been flagged in their quarterly review. Turnover was high, especially among mid-level managers and senior coordinators, exactly the people who actually understood operations and kept client relationships functional. The problem, Blackstone announced with the authority of someone who'd never worried about his own job security, is that people today don't understand loyalty. They expect constant validation and advancement opportunities, instead of being grateful for steady employment. In my father's generation, people appreciated having good jobs and didn't constantly look for something better. Marcus jumped in immediately. "It's definitely a generational thing, Dad. These younger employees think they deserve promotions just for showing up and doing their jobs. They don't understand that advancement has to be earned through years of proving yourself and demonstrating company values." Morrison tried to interject with actual data. "The exit interviews suggest that people are leaving primarily due to limited growth opportunities and compensation that doesn't match market rates. Our salary structures haven't been updated in 4 years, and several departed employees mentioned feeling undervalued despite strong performance reviews. Blackstone waved this away dismissively. "Helena, you can't manage a business based on what disgruntled former employees say in exit interviews. People always blame the company when they leave, instead of taking responsibility for their own limitations. If they were really valuable, they'd find ways to make themselves indispensable here, instead of chasing imaginary opportunities somewhere else." The conversation continued for another hour, during which they managed to dismiss every suggestion for improving employee satisfaction while convincing themselves that the real problem was worker entitlement rather than management failure. They attributed departures to character flaws in their former employees rather than systemic issues in their leadership approach. They interpreted requests for professional development as evidence of disloyalty rather than ambition. But the most telling moment came when Marcus mentioned Jenny Walsh, the logistics coordinator who'd been with the company for 15 years and had recently submitted her resignation. "I just don't understand Jenny's attitude lately," Marcus complained. "She's been pushing these elaborate process improvement proposals that would require significant changes to how we handle client accounts. It's like she thinks she knows more about running the business than we do, just because she's been doing the same job for a long time." Morrison looked up from her notes. "Actually, Marcus, Jenny's proposals address several recurring client complaints. Her process improvements could reduce delivery delays by an estimated 30% while cutting operational costs. The implementation timeline she suggested is realistic, and the projected ROI is substantial." Blackstone frowned. "That's exactly the problem. Jenny's a good worker, but she's a coordinator, not a strategist. When coordinators start thinking they understand strategy, it creates confusion about roles and responsibilities. We can't have people at every level of the organization second-guessing leadership decisions based on their limited perspective of day-to-day operations." Plus, Marcus added, "if we start implementing suggestions from coordinators, what message does that send to our management team? People need to understand their place in the organizational hierarchy. Jenny's job is to coordinate logistics efficiently, not to redesign business processes." I had to steady myself against the supply cart as the implications of this conversation sank in. Jenny Walsh was one of the most competent people in the building, someone who understood American Dynamics operations better than the executives who dismissed her expertise. Her process improvement proposals weren't ambitious overreach. They were professional recommendations from someone who'd identified solutions to problems that were costing the company clients and revenue. But in Blackstone and Marcus's worldview, Jenny's competence was actually a threat to organizational stability. Her suggestions weren't valuable insights. They were evidence that she didn't understand her proper place in their hierarchy. Her 15 years of experience weren't credentials that qualified her to contribute to strategic thinking. They were proof that she should be satisfied with her current role and stop aspiring to influence beyond her designated level. The pattern repeated itself in different variations throughout the weeks that followed. David Chen, the operations analyst, was criticized for overcomplicating solutions to supply chain problems that required sophisticated analysis. Sarah Martinez, the client relations manager, was told to focus on relationship management rather than offering strategic recommendations about service improvements that clients had specifically requested. Even among the executives, the hierarchy was rigidly maintained. Morrison's data-driven insights were regularly overruled by Blackstone's intuition-based decisions, not because her analysis was flawed, but because challenging his conclusions was seen as insubordination rather than professional discourse. When she presented evidence that contradicted their strategic assumptions, they questioned her commitment to the team rather than examining whether their assumptions might be wrong. The most revealing incident occurred during my 6th month, when I was cleaning the executive restroom and overheard a phone conversation that Marcus was having with his girlfriend while he thought he was alone in the building. He was complaining about the stress of managing people who didn't appreciate his leadership style. "It's so frustrating," he was saying. "Like, I'm trying to mentor these people and help them understand how successful companies operate, but they keep pushing back on everything. Jenny acts like she's been personally insulted when I explain why her suggestions won't work. David gets defensive when I point out flaws in his analysis. Even some of the newer employees seem to think they should have input on decisions that are way above their pay grade." He paused, presumably listening to his girlfriend's response, then continued. The thing is, they don't understand that leadership requires a different perspective than what you get from doing operational work. Like, Dad always says that you can't manage a forest by studying individual trees. These people are so focused on details that they miss the bigger picture. That's why we need strong leadership to maintain vision and direction. The conversation went on for another 10 minutes, during which Marcus convinced himself that employee pushback was evidence of his leadership effectiveness rather than incompetence. In his mind, resistance to his ideas proved that he was challenging people to think beyond their comfort zones rather than proposing changes that ignored operational realities. But the most damaging aspect of American Dynamics' dismissal pattern wasn't how they treated their employees, it was how they talked about people like me when they thought no one was listening. The service staff, contractors, and support personnel who kept their building functioning were discussed as if we were equipment rather than people, problems to be managed rather than individuals with capabilities and perspectives. During a facilities management meeting I overheard while restocking supplies, Morrison was discussing security protocols with the building manager. The conversation turned to access controls and information security, specifically regarding cleaning and maintenance staff. "I think we need to be more systematic about limiting access to sensitive areas," Morrison was saying. "The cleaning crew has keys to every office, including executive spaces where confidential documents might be visible. Most of these people probably don't speak English well enough to understand what they're seeing, but we should still minimize exposure." The building manager nodded. "That's standard practice. We can restrict access to certain areas during cleaning hours and require escorts for sensitive locations. Most cleaning staff just want to do their jobs efficiently and get home. They're not interested in corporate information they wouldn't understand anyway." Morrison agreed. "Exactly. Plus, the turnover in these positions is usually high, so it's not like we're dealing with long-term security risks. These are temporary workers who move between different clients. They don't have any stake in our business or reason to pay attention to information that doesn't affect them directly." Listening to this conversation while wearing the uniform that marked me as one of these people, I felt a familiar combination of anger and clarity. They weren't just dismissing my relevance. They were constructing elaborate justifications for why my irrelevance was natural, inevitable, and permanent. In their minds, people like me lacked the language skills, intellectual capacity, and professional investment to pose any kind of threat to their information security or competitive position. The assumption that I didn't speak English well enough to understand their conversations was particularly insulting, given that I'd written my college thesis on supply chain optimization and conducted briefings for military commanders who controlled billion-dollar logistics operations. But the deeper insult was their certainty that even if I could understand their business discussions, I wouldn't have the capability or motivation to act on that information in ways that might affect their company. They were wrong on every count. I spoke English perfectly, understood their business better than they did, and was already acting on information I gathered during cleaning shifts in ways that were systematically dismantling their competitive position. But their assumptions about people like me were so entrenched that they couldn't imagine alternatives to the reality they'd constructed. That reality was about to be tested in ways they couldn't anticipate. Because while they dismissed my relevance based on my uniform and assumed limitations based on my position, I was building proof that their assumptions were not just wrong but catastrophically dangerous to everything they thought they controlled. The pattern of dismissal that seemed so natural to them was about to become the foundation of their downfall. The ironic situations began piling up like evidence in a case I was building without conscious intent, each one more absurd than the last. Every night, I'd witnessed the growing desperation at American Dynamics as they struggled with problems I was solving for their competitors during my day shifts. Every morning, I'd implement solutions for MS Enterprises clients that directly addressed the exact challenges Blackstone, Marcus, and Morrison discussed in meetings they thought were private. The first major irony emerged during my 8th month when I was cleaning Blackstone's office and noticed a proposal on his desk from Southeastern Manufacturing Group, a company that had become one of MS Enterprises' most successful clients after switching from American Dynamics 6 months earlier. The proposal was American Dynamics' desperate attempt to win back a contract worth $2.8 million annually, offering service improvements and cost reductions that were laughably inadequate compared to what they'd already lost. Southeastern had terminated their relationship with American Dynamics after a series of delivery failures that cost them a major automotive contract. Their CEO, Robert Chen, had been blunt in his termination letter, which I'd seen fragments of in Morrison's wastebasket. Your company's inability to adapt to our evolving logistics requirements has become a liability we can no longer afford. We're transitioning to a consulting firm that understands modern supply chain management. That consulting firm was MS Enterprises. Within 2 months of taking over Southeastern's logistics operations, my team had eliminated their delivery delays, reduced their inventory costs by 35%, and implemented tracking systems that gave them supply chain visibility they'd never experienced. The results were so dramatic that Southeastern's CEO had recommended us to 4 other companies in his industry network. Now, American Dynamics was offering Southeastern a quote to logistics management that included features my company had implemented months earlier. They were promising delivery performance metrics that MS Enterprises was already exceeding. They were proposing cost savings that were fractions of what we'd already delivered. Reading their proposal while emptying Blackstone's trash, I felt like watching someone try to sell ice to an Eskimo while standing in an igloo. The cognitive dissonance deepened when I overheard Blackstone's phone conversation with Marcus about their strategy for winning back Southeastern's business. He was convinced that their former client had made an emotional decision based on temporary service issues, rather than a rational assessment of long-term value. The problem, Blackstone explained to his son, is that Robert Chen let a few operational hiccups cloud his judgment about our overall relationship. These manufacturing guys get focused on short-term metrics instead of seeing the strategic partnership we were building. Now he's probably working with some fly-by-night consultant who promised him the moon but won't be able to deliver sustained results. Marcus agreed enthusiastically. Exactly, Dad. Plus, we've learned from those service issues and implemented improvements that address his concerns. Once we present our new proposal, he'll realize that established firms like us offer stability and reliability that boutique consultants can't match. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which they convinced themselves that Southeastern's departure was based on misunderstanding rather than performance failure, and that their former client would inevitably return once he experienced the limitations of working with smaller firms. They never considered the possibility that Southeastern had found better service elsewhere, not because they couldn't imagine superior alternatives to their approach, but because they couldn't conceive of competitors who might actually be superior. This pattern of denial reached comic proportions during a strategy meeting I witnessed while cleaning the conference room next door. Morrison was presenting quarterly results that showed continued client defections and market share losses, while Blackstone and Marcus developed increasingly elaborate theories about external factors beyond their control. The whole industry is experiencing disruption, Blackstone announced with the confidence of someone who'd read a Harvard Business Review article and extrapolated universal principles from limited data. These technological changes are creating artificial advantages for companies that prioritize flashy innovations over proven business practices. It's a classic market correction. The fundamentals always reassert themselves eventually. Marcus nodded sagely. Right. And some of these new competitors are definitely operating on unsustainable business models. They're probably using venture capital funding to offer below-market pricing that they can't maintain long-term. Once their initial investment runs out, clients will realize they need partners with real staying power. Morrison tried to inject reality into this fantasy by presenting specific data about competitor performance and client feedback, but her analysis got filtered through their preconceptions about market dynamics and technological disruption. Every piece of evidence that contradicted their worldview was reinterpreted as temporary aberration, rather than fundamental challenge to their assumptions. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The irony reached its peak when they started discussing MS Enterprises directly, having identified my company as a recurring theme in client departure explanations. They'd gathered intelligence about my firm through industry networks and former clients. But the picture they'd assembled was so distorted by their assumptions that it bore little resemblance to reality. "This MS Enterprises outfit is interesting," Morrison reported during one of their weekly strategy sessions. "They seem to specialize in mid-market manufacturing clients, exactly the segment where we're losing traction. Their approach emphasizes customized solutions and rapid implementation, which appeals to companies that want immediate results." Blackstone frowned. "That's exactly the problem with these boutique firms. They promise rapid results because they're cutting corners on proper analysis and long-term planning. Customized solutions sound appealing, but they're expensive to maintain and difficult to scale. Clients get seduced by initial improvements but end up paying premium prices for services they could get more efficiently from established providers." Marcus leaned forward, excited to contribute his analysis. "Plus, firms like this usually depend on one or two key people who do all the real work. If something happens to their founder or lead consultant, the whole operation falls apart. That's why smart clients stick with companies that have institutional knowledge and systematic approaches, rather than betting everything on individual expertise." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in confirmation bias, as they constructed increasingly elaborate explanations for why MS Enterprises' success was unsustainable, why our clients would eventually return to more traditional providers, and why American Dynamics' approach was fundamentally superior despite mounting evidence to the contrary. They weren't analyzing their competition. They were creating mythology that preserved their self-image while explaining away their failures. But the most surreal moment came when Morrison mentioned that she'd tried to research MS Enterprises' leadership structure and couldn't find much information about the company's founder or organizational hierarchy. "It's surprisingly opaque," she told Blackstone and Marcus. "The business registration lists an M. Santos as the principal, but there's no background information available through normal channels. No LinkedIn profile, no industry conference appearances, no press interviews. Either they're extremely private or there's something unusual about their setup." Blackstone shrugged dismissively. "That's probably strategic obscurity. Some consultants prefer to let their work speak for itself rather than building personal brands. Or maybe Santos is a front person for investors who want to maintain anonymity. Either way, it doesn't change the fundamental dynamics of what they're offering versus what we provide." Marcus nodded. "Right, and mysterious leadership is usually a red flag for potential clients. Established companies want to know who they're working with and what kind of institutional stability they can expect. The fact that MS Enterprises is so secretive about their organization probably limits their growth potential." Sitting in the supply closet listening to this analysis of my company's leadership structure, I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. They were discussing M. Santos, me, as if I were some shadowy figure whose mysterious background raised questions about MS Enterprises' legitimacy and long-term viability. Meanwhile, M. Santos was literally in the room with them, emptying their wastebaskets and wiping down their conference table while they speculated about my identity and motivations. The irony was so complete it felt almost fictional. They were losing clients to a competitor whose founder cleaned their offices every night. They were developing strategies to counter a consulting firm run by someone they paid minimum wage to restock their supply closets. They were analyzing the threat posed by MS Enterprises, while the person responsible for that threat was invisible to them, not because I was hiding, but because their assumptions about people like me made my actual identity literally unthinkable. The situation became even more absurd when they started discussing specific tactics for competing against my company. Marcus suggested that American Dynamics should emphasize their stability and institutional knowledge in client presentations, contrasting their established track record with the uncertainty of working with newer firms. Morrison proposed developing case studies that demonstrated the risks of switching to boutique consultants who might lack the resources to handle complex projects. Blackstone endorsed a strategy that involved highlighting the personal relationships American Dynamics had built with clients over years of partnership, arguing that business decisions should be based on trust and proven reliability rather than promises from unknown competitors. Every strategy they developed was based on assumptions about MS Enterprises that were completely wrong, and every competitive advantage they claimed was contradicted by evidence they encountered daily but couldn't process because it didn't fit their worldview. They were fighting a war against an enemy they couldn't see, using weapons that strengthened their opponent's position while weakening their own. The ultimate irony was that their best source of intelligence about MS Enterprises was sitting right in front of them every night, wearing a uniform that rendered me invisible to people who prided themselves on their strategic thinking and competitive awareness. They were paying me to observe their failures while I implemented their solutions elsewhere, funding their own competitive disadvantage while building the very threat they couldn't figure out how to counter. But the situation was about to shift from ironic to explosive, because their assumptions about MS Enterprises, about people like me, and about the nature of business competition itself were about to collide with reality in ways that would shatter everything they thought they understood about their world and their place in it. The breaking point came on a humid Thursday evening in August when I walked into American Dynamics for what I didn't yet know would be my final shift as Maria Santos, the invisible janitor. The air conditioning was struggling against the Atlanta heat, and the executive floor felt heavy with more than just humidity. There was tension in the scattered papers, the hastily abandoned coffee cups, the whiteboards covered with crisis management diagrams that suggested panic rather than planning. I'd arrived 30 minutes early because my MS, the enterprise's schedule, was lighter than usual. 3 of my clients were implementing systems I'd designed and no longer needed daily consultation, which gave me extra time to focus on American Dynamics' continuing deterioration. What I found when I badged into the building was a company in the middle of a full-scale emergency that they'd been building toward for months without recognizing the warning signs. The first indication came from the unusual number of cars still in the executive parking area at 6:30 p.m. Normally, only Morrison's vehicle remained past 6 o'clock, but tonight I counted 8 cars in spaces reserved for senior management and department heads. Through the lobby windows, I could see lights on throughout the administrative floors and the kind of frantic activity that suggested either a major opportunity or a major crisis. As I wheeled my cleaning cart toward the service elevator, I passed Jenny Walsh in the main hallway, carrying a banker's box and looking like someone who'd been crying. She was one of the few employees who'd always treated me with basic courtesy, and seeing her obvious distress made me pause despite my instinct to remain invisible. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly, stepping slightly aside to let her pass. She looked at me with the kind of recognition that comes from shared experience with workplace indignity. "Oh, Maria, I'm sorry, I didn't expect anyone else to be here this late." "I'm fine, today was my last day, I'm clearing out my desk." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Jenny Walsh had been with American Dynamics for 15 years. She was the most competent logistics coordinator in the building, the person who actually understood how their operations worked, the employee whose process improvement proposals had been dismissed as evidence that she didn't understand her place in the organizational hierarchy. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it more than she could know. "Are you going somewhere better?" She managed a small smile. "I hope so. A consulting firm offered me a position designing supply chain solutions for manufacturing clients. It's exactly the kind of work I wanted to do here, but..." She trailed off, then shook her head. "Anyway, I'm excited about the opportunity. The founder is supposed to be brilliant, someone who really understands operations. I've heard amazing things about their clients' results." I kept my expression neutral while my mind raced. Jenny was talking about MS Enterprises. She was describing the position I'd offered her after watching American Dynamics waste her expertise for years. She didn't know that the consultant who'd recruited her was the same woman who'd been emptying her wastebasket and restocking her supply closet. But she was about to become a key part of the team that was systematically dismantling her former employer's business model. "That sounds wonderful," I told her honestly. "You deserve to work somewhere that values what you bring." She thanked me and continued toward the exit, while I stood in the hallway processing the implications. Jenny's departure wasn't just the loss of a competent employee. It was the migration of institutional knowledge from American Dynamics to MS Enterprises. Everything she'd learned about their operational failures, client relationships, and internal dysfunction would now inform strategies designed to compete against them more effectively. But Jenny wasn't the only departure. As I made my way through the building that night, I discovered evidence of a broader exodus that had apparently accelerated over the past week. David Chen's office was empty, his diplomas and family photos replaced by bare walls and disconnected computer cables. Sarah Martinez's desk showed signs of hasty packing, with desk drawers partially opened and personal items missing from their usual places. The picture became clearer when I reached the executive floor and began cleaning around the conference room, where an emergency meeting was obviously in progress. Through the glass walls, I could see Blackstone, Marcus, Morrison, and 3 other department heads hunched over laptops and spreadsheets, their body language suggesting damage control rather than strategic planning. I started my cleaning routine in the adjacent break room, positioning myself where I could hear their conversation without appearing to eavesdrop. What I learned made me understand why cars were still in the parking lot at this late hour, and why Jenny had been crying when she left the building. "The hemorrhaging has to stop," Morrison was saying, her voice tight with stress I'd never heard before. "We've lost 4 senior coordinators, 2 analysts, and 3 client managers in the past 2 weeks. That's not normal turnover. That's systematic talent drain that's affecting our operational capacity." Blackstone's response carried the frustration of someone whose comfortable assumptions were being challenged by uncomfortable realities. "These people are making emotional decisions based on short-term frustrations instead of long-term career stability. The job market is hot right now, so they're chasing opportunities that promise faster advancement or higher compensation without considering the risks." Marcus jumped in with his usual confident ignorance. "Plus, some of these departures are probably coordinated. Competitors might be actively recruiting our people to gain intelligence about our operations and client relationships. It's industrial espionage disguised as normal job movement." Morrison pulled up something on her laptop screen. "Actually, Marcus, that's not entirely wrong. I've been tracking where people are going, and there's a pattern. Jenny Walsh, David Chen, and Sarah Martinez all took positions with consulting firms that specialize in logistics and supply chain optimization. 2 of them specifically mentioned working with companies that serve our client base." The conversation paused as they absorbed this information, and I felt my pulse quicken. They were beginning to see connections they couldn't quite understand, patterns that threatened their worldview without revealing the full scope of what was happening. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, visibly frustrated. "So what are you suggesting, Helena? That there's some kind of conspiracy to systematically recruit our employees? That's paranoid thinking that distracts from the real issues we need to address." "I'm suggesting," Morrison replied carefully, "that our competitors understand the value of experienced personnel better than we do. When talented people feel undervalued here, they become attractive targets for companies that offer better opportunities. We're essentially training employees for our competition instead of creating reasons for them to stay." The truth of her statement hung in the air like an indictment none of them wanted to acknowledge. American Dynamics wasn't just losing employees, they were losing them to competitors who recognized capabilities that Blackstone and Marcus had consistently dismissed. The company's rigid hierarchy, limited advancement opportunities, and resistance to employee input were creating a pipeline of talent directly into the hands of firms that valued competence over compliance. But the real breaking point came when Morrison mentioned specific client losses that had accelerated alongside the employee departures. "Piedmont Industrial confirmed this morning that they're not renewing their contract," she announced quietly. "That's $1.8 million in annual revenue. Atlantic Components is reviewing alternatives for next quarter. Southeastern Manufacturing's replacement decision is final. They're not coming back. And Coastal Manufacturing just informed us that they're consolidating their logistics consulting with a single provider that isn't us." The silence that followed was thick, with implications none of them wanted to voice. These weren't isolated client decisions. They represented a systematic rejection of American Dynamics' value proposition by exactly the kind of companies they'd built their business model around serving. Blackstone finally spoke, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "What's the common factor in these departures? Are we looking at coordinated competitive pressure, or are there specific service issues we need to address urgently?" Morrison consulted her notes before answering. "The common factor appears to be performance expectations that our current operational capacity can't meet. These clients are requesting service levels and analytical capabilities that require expertise we no longer have in-house. When they can't get what they need from us, they find providers who can deliver." Marcus looked confused. "But we offered Piedmont enhanced service packages and competitive pricing adjustments." Why would they choose uncertainty with a new provider over improved terms with a company they know? The question revealed everything wrong with their understanding of business relationships. They still believed that client decisions were based on pricing and familiarity rather than results and capability. They couldn't grasp that companies like Piedmont weren't looking for enhanced versions of inadequate service. They were looking for fundamentally different approaches to logistics challenges that American Dynamics couldn't provide. Morrison tried to explain this reality without directly challenging their leadership competence. The feedback suggests that these clients need more sophisticated supply chain analysis and customized implementation strategies than our standard service packages include. They're not just looking for cost savings, they want operational transformation that creates competitive advantages. But Blackstone and Marcus filtered this information through their existing assumptions about market dynamics and client psychology. Instead of recognizing that their service model was fundamentally inadequate for modern logistics challenges, they interpreted client departures as evidence of market irrationality and competitor manipulation. That's exactly the problem, Blackstone declared with renewed confidence. These clients are being sold on consulting fantasies that promise transformation but deliver complexity. They'll realize eventually that sustainable business relationships are built on proven reliability, not experimental approaches from firms that may not even be viable long-term. As I listened to this conversation while methodically cleaning around their crisis meeting, I felt the last restraints of professional discretion dissolve into something harder and more focused. They weren't just failing, they were failing while constructing elaborate justifications for why their failure was actually evidence of their superiority. They weren't just losing talented employees, they were losing them while convincing themselves that talent was less important than loyalty. They weren't just being outcompeted, they were being systematically dismantled by someone they saw every night but couldn't imagine as a threat. The breaking point wasn't a single moment of dramatic realization. It was the accumulation of months of watching competent people be dismissed, good ideas be rejected, and obvious solutions be ignored by leaders who mistook confidence for competence and position for qualification. It was the growing certainty that American Dynamics would continue destroying value, wasting talent, and serving clients poorly, as long as people like Blackstone and Marcus controlled decisions they were fundamentally unqualified to make. But most of all, it was the recognition that I had become complicit in their failures by remaining silent about alternatives that I knew were possible. Every night I cleaned their offices while they struggled with problems I was solving elsewhere. I was choosing invisibility over accountability, safety over justice, and personal convenience over professional responsibility. That choice was about to end. Because some breaking points aren't about what happens to you, they're about what you finally decide to do about what you've been watching happen to others. The strategic setup began the moment I left American Dynamics that Thursday night, driving through empty Atlanta streets, while my mind shifted from Maria Santos, the invisible janitor, to the founder of MS Enterprises, who was about to orchestrate the most carefully planned corporate revelation in my professional career. The pieces had been in position for months. I just hadn't realized I was building toward this moment until I witnessed their crisis meeting and understood that their collapse was accelerating beyond their ability to manage or understand. By Friday morning, I was sitting in my home office with 3 monitors displaying information that would have terrified American Dynamics leadership if they'd understood what they were looking at. Client list showing their former customers who were now thriving under MS Enterprises management. Financial projections demonstrating the revenue streams they'd lost to competitors they couldn't identify. Personnel files documenting the systematic talent drain that was hollowing out their operational capacity while strengthening mine. But the most powerful weapon in my arsenal wasn't data. It was credibility. Over 18 months, MS Enterprises had built a reputation for delivering results that established consulting firms promised but couldn't achieve. Our client testimonials read like indictments of traditional logistics consulting approaches. Our case studies demonstrated efficiency improvements that seemed impossible until they were implemented. Our growth trajectory showed what happened when competence was allowed to operate without interference from ego-driven leadership. The first strategic decision was timing. American Dynamics was entering their quarterly board review cycle, a process that would force Blackstone to present performance metrics to investors who were already questioning the company's declining market position. Their board meetings were scheduled for the third Thursday of every month, which gave me exactly 2 weeks to orchestrate a revelation that would coincide with their most vulnerable moment. I started by reaching out to former American Dynamics employees who'd joined MS Enterprises or other competing firms. Jenny Walsh was the obvious first call, but she was only part of a larger network of displaced talent that had been systematically undervalued by Blackstone's leadership philosophy. David Chen had landed at a tech consulting firm where his analytical skills were actually appreciated. Sarah Martinez was working for a manufacturing consortium where her client relationship expertise was being used to design customer service protocols rather than just manage complaints. Each conversation revealed the same pattern: competent professionals who'd been frustrated by American Dynamics' refusal to utilize their capabilities were now thriving in environments that valued expertise over hierarchy. They'd all tried to contribute meaningfully to American Dynamics' success, and they'd all been dismissed or marginalized by leaders who saw employee input as insubordination rather than asset development. But more importantly, they were all willing to document their experiences in ways that would devastate American Dynamics' reputation if presented properly. Not through vindictive complaints or personal attacks, but through professional testimonials that demonstrated the systematic mismanagement of human resources that had driven talent directly into competitors' hands. Jenny Walsh's story was particularly damaging because it illustrated how American Dynamics had rejected solutions to problems that were now costing them millions in lost revenue. Her process improvement proposals, dismissed by Marcus as evidence that she didn't understand organizational hierarchy, had been implemented at MS Enterprises and were generating the efficiency improvements she'd predicted. The same ideas that Blackstone had characterized as inappropriate ambition from a coordinator were now being used to outcompete his company in markets he'd considered secure. David Chen's experience revealed how American Dynamics had ignored technological solutions that could have modernized their operations and improved client service. His analytical frameworks, criticized as overcomplicated by leadership that preferred intuitive decision-making, were now being used by competitors to identify market opportunities that American Dynamics couldn't recognize. The data-driven approaches he'd advocated were helping other firms anticipate client needs and adapt to market changes, while American Dynamics struggled with reactive crisis management. Sarah Martinez's documentation was perhaps the most revealing because it showed how American Dynamics had mismanaged client relationships through systematic failure to listen to feedback or adapt services to changing requirements. Her recommendations for service improvements, dismissed as impossible or unnecessary by executives who prioritized maintaining existing processes over satisfying evolving client needs, were now being implemented by firms that were stealing American Dynamics clients by offering exactly what those clients had been requesting for years. The second strategic element was evidence compilation. I needed documentation that was unassailable, comprehensive, and presented in formats that would be immediately recognizable to business professionals and media analysts. This wasn't about personal grievances or workplace complaints. This was about systematic business failure that had measurable impacts on employees, clients, and market dynamics. Working through my network of veteran consultants, I gathered performance data that told the story of American Dynamics' decline in objective, quantifiable terms. Client retention rates that had dropped consistently over 18 months. Employee turnover figures that were triple industry averages for comparable firms. Revenue loss projections that showed how their mismanagement was creating opportunities for more competent competitors. But the most powerful evidence was comparative analysis, showing how former American Dynamics employees and clients were performing under different management approaches. The same people who'd been characterized as limited or difficult by Blackstone's leadership were achieving exceptional results when their capabilities were properly utilized. The same clients who'd been dismissed as having unrealistic expectations were thriving with service providers who could meet their actual requirements. I compiled this information into a comprehensive presentation that read like a business school case study in management failure. Not a personal attack on individual executives, but a systematic analysis of how leadership incompetence creates competitive vulnerabilities that more capable firms can exploit. The data was devastating precisely because it was objective, professional, and focused on outcomes rather than personalities. The third strategic component was media coordination. The business press in Atlanta had been following American Dynamics' struggles without understanding the underlying causes or broader implications. Their decline was being attributed to market forces and industry disruption rather than management failure, partly because no one had access to information that revealed the real story. I reached out to Patricia Williams, a business journalist at the Atlanta Business Chronicle, who specialized in logistics and supply chain management. She'd written several articles about consulting industry dynamics and had demonstrated both professional competence and genuine interest in understanding complex business stories. More importantly, she had a reputation for thorough research and fact-based reporting, rather than sensationalism. My initial contact was indirect, a tip from an anonymous source suggesting that American Dynamics problems represented a larger story about management practices in traditional consulting firms and how employee mismanagement was creating opportunities for more innovative competitors. I provided enough information to pique her interest without revealing my identity or connection to the situation. Williams began investigating independently, interviewing former employees, analyzing public financial records, and researching industry trends that supported the narrative I'd suggested. Her preliminary research confirmed what I already knew. American Dynamics was hemorrhaging talent and clients due to systematic leadership failures that were creating competitive advantages for firms like MS Enterprises. The fourth strategic element was legal preparation. Everything I was planning was legal, ethical, and professionally justified, but I needed documentation that would protect MS Enterprises and my former colleagues from potential retaliation attempts. Corporate revelations of this magnitude often trigger defensive responses that include litigation threats, especially when they expose management incompetence that affects investor confidence. I worked with my corporate attorney to ensure that all evidence was properly obtained, all testimonials were voluntary and truthful, and all media interactions complied with disclosure requirements. The goal wasn't to avoid legal challenges. It was to make any legal challenges obviously frivolous and potentially damaging to the firms that initiated them. Most importantly, I needed to establish the professional legitimacy of MS Enterprises in ways that would withstand scrutiny from competitors trying to discredit our success. Our client testimonials, performance metrics, and industry certifications needed to be unquestionable. Our business practices needed to be exemplary. Our growth trajectory needed to be sustainable and well documented. The final strategic preparation was personal. For 18 months, I'd been living a double life that required constant mental compartmentalization and emotional discipline. Maria Santos, the janitor, had to remain invisible and unremarkable while MS Enterprises' founder built a business empire that was systematically destroying the company where Maria worked nights. That compartmentalization was about to end in the most public way possible. Within 2 weeks, everyone who dismissed me as irrelevant furniture would learn that the woman they'd looked through had been looking right back at them and building something that made their assumptions about competence, hierarchy, and professional worth look catastrophically naive. But the revelation wouldn't just be about personal vindication. It would be about demonstrating that talent exists in places that traditional power structures refuse to recognize, that competence often thrives outside established hierarchies, and that the most dangerous competitors are the ones you never thought to consider as threats. The setup was complete, the evidence was compiled, the timing was perfect. The only question remaining was whether American Dynamics leadership would recognize their situation quickly enough to minimize the damage, or whether their assumptions about people like me would blind them to reality until it was too late to recover. Based on everything I'd observed over 18 months of cleaning their offices and listening to their meetings, I was confident they'd choose the latter, which meant the revelation was going to be even more brutal than they could imagine. The revelation moment arrived on a Tuesday morning that began like any other at American Dynamics, with executives arriving for what they believed was a routine quarterly board meeting to discuss standard performance metrics and strategic planning initiatives. What they didn't know was that their boardroom was about to become ground zero for the most comprehensive corporate reality check in the company's history. I arrived at the building at 9 a.m. through the main entrance, not the service door I'd used for 18 months. Instead of my blue janitorial uniform, I wore a charcoal business suit, leather portfolio, and the kind of confident bearing that comes from knowing you're about to rewrite everyone's understanding of power dynamics. The security guard who'd barely acknowledged my existence for over a year now looked at me with confusion, clearly recognizing my face but unable to place it in this new context. "I'm here for the American Dynamics board meeting," I told him, handing over a business card that read Maria Santos, founder and CEO, MS Enterprises. His expression shifted from confusion to something approaching shock as the implications began to register. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt different when I was riding it as an invited participant rather than invisible support staff. Every surface I'd cleaned hundreds of times looked the same, but felt transformed by the shift in my relationship to the space. The conference room, where I'd emptied ashtrays and wiped whiteboards, was about to host a presentation that would demolish every assumption the people inside had made about competence, hierarchy, and who deserved to be taken seriously in their professional world. Blackstone, Marcus, Morrison, and 6 board members were already seated around the mahogany table when I entered. The initial reactions were exactly what I'd expected. Confusion from people who couldn't quite place my familiar face in this unfamiliar context, followed by slowly dawning recognition that created visible discomfort as they struggled to reconcile their memories of Maria the janitor, with the professional woman now taking a seat at their conference table. Morrison was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled but clearly strained. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion about today's agenda. We're expecting a presentation from MS Enterprises, but..." She trailed off as the impossibility of what she was seeing conflicted with her need to maintain professional composure. "There's no confusion," I replied, opening my portfolio and placing a bound presentation on the table. "I'm Maria Santos, founder and CEO of MS Enterprises. I believe you've been discussing my company quite extensively in your recent strategy meetings." The silence that followed was so complete, it felt physical, as if the air itself had thickened around their inability to process this information. Blackstone's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a kind of shocked anger that seemed directed at reality itself for violating his expectations about how the world worked. Marcus was the first to find his voice, though what came out was more accusation than question. "This is impossible. You're the cleaning lady. You empty our trash cans. You don't run consulting firms." "Actually," I said, pulling out my laptop and connecting it to the conference room's presentation system, "I do both. Though after today, only one of those things will continue to be true." The screen behind me lit up with the MS Enterprises logo and a presentation title that made their situation crystal clear: Case Study in Strategic Mismanagement, How Leadership Assumptions Create Competitive Vulnerabilities. Below the title was a subtitle that hit like a surgical strike: An Analysis of American Dynamics, Systematic Talent Mismanagement and Market Share Loss, 2022 to 2024. Blackstone attempted to regain control of the situation through authority assertion. "This is highly irregular. Board meetings have specific protocols, and we can't have unauthorized personnel making presentations without proper vetting and approval processes." One of the board members, Patricia Chen, who I recognized as David Chen's mother and a respected logistics industry veteran, leaned forward with interest rather than alarm. "Actually, Richard, I think we should hear what Ms. Santos has to say. MS Enterprises has been making quite an impression in our industry, and if there's a connection to American Dynamics' recent challenges, the board needs to understand it." I clicked to the first slide, which displayed a timeline showing American Dynamics client losses over the past 18 months, alongside MS Enterprises client acquisitions during the same period. The correlation was visually obvious and professionally devastating. This presentation documents how systematic mismanagement of human resources creates competitive advantages for firms that recognize talent regardless of its packaging, I began, my voice carrying the same calm authority I'd used in military briefings, where lives depended on clear communication. Over the past 18 months, American Dynamics has lost approximately 40% of its market share in mid-sized manufacturing logistics, while MS Enterprises has captured contracts worth $12.8 million annually from clients who terminated relationships with this company. Morrison was frantically taking notes, clearly recognizing the business implications even as she struggled with the personal revelation. "How is this possible? We had no indication that there was any connection." between the woman who cleaned your offices and the consultant who was out competing you for clients. I clicked to the next slide, which showed organizational charts for both companies. The connection was always there. You simply chose not to see it. The slide displayed my military service record, business education credentials, and MS Enterprises founding documents. Every qualification that should have made me a valuable addition to American Dynamics' team was listed in chronological order, alongside dates showing how long I'd been working as their janitorial staff while building their primary competition. Marcus looked like someone whose fundamental worldview was collapsing in real time, but you never said anything. You never mentioned your background or experience. You just cleaned. I applied for consulting positions at American Dynamics when I returned from military service, I replied, clicking to a slide that displayed my original job applications and the rejection letters I'd received. I was told that my background wasn't the right fit for your company culture, so I found other ways to learn about your operations while building something better. The rejection letters were displayed in full, including feedback that suggested I consider transitional positions in administration rather than strategic roles. The contrast between their assessment of my capabilities and MS Enterprises' subsequent success was visually obvious and professionally humiliating. Blackstone's anger was building as the implications became clear. This is industrial espionage. You used your access to our facilities to gather competitive intelligence and steal our clients. This is illegal and unethical. I had anticipated this response and was prepared with documentation that destroyed his accusation. Everything I learned about American Dynamics operations came from observing meetings you held in conference rooms where I was working, reading documents you left in wastebaskets, and listening to conversations you had in my presence because you assumed I was irrelevant. Industrial espionage requires covert intelligence gathering. This was simply paying attention while you demonstrated your operational failures in front of someone you'd decided didn't matter. The next slide showed a compilation of direct quotes from executive meetings I'd overheard, accompanied by dates, locations, and context. Every dismissive comment about employee capabilities, every strategic miscalculation, every client relationship failure was documented with the precision of someone trained in military intelligence gathering. Patricia Chen was clearly fascinated by the presentation's implications for corporate governance and strategic planning. Ms. Santos, can you explain how American Dynamics management practices contributed to their competitive vulnerabilities? I clicked through a series of slides that documented the systematic pattern of talent mismanagement that had driven their most competent employees directly into their competitors' hands. Ginny Walsh's process improvement proposals were displayed alongside MS Enterprises' implementation of those same ideas for former American Dynamics clients. David Chen's analytical frameworks were shown being used to identify market opportunities that American Dynamics had missed. Sarah Martinez's client service recommendations were demonstrated through case studies, showing how other firms had captured American Dynamics' clients by implementing exactly what those clients had been requesting. The core problem, I explained, is that American Dynamics leadership consistently dismissed expertise that didn't conform to their preconceptions about organizational hierarchy. Instead of utilizing available talent, they created a talent pipeline that fed directly to their competitors. Morrison was beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. The employee departures, the client losses, you orchestrated all of this? I didn't orchestrate anything, I replied. I simply created an alternative for people and companies that were being underserved by your management approach. When talent is systematically undervalued, it finds places where it's appreciated. When clients can't get adequate service from their current provider, they seek better alternatives. MS Enterprises succeeded because we offered what American Dynamics refused to provide. The final slide showed MS Enterprises' current client roster, revenue projections, and growth trajectory. The numbers were impressive by any industry standard, but they were devastating when contextualized as market share that had been systematically transferred from American Dynamics due to leadership failures that were entirely preventable. Blackstone made one last attempt to salvage his authority through personal attack. This whole presentation is just revenge fantasy from someone who couldn't succeed through normal channels. You're trying to destroy this company because you weren't good enough to advance here legitimately. I closed my laptop and stood, my military bearing evident as I prepared to deliver the final blow. Mr. Blackstone, I didn't destroy this company. I simply built a better alternative while you demonstrated why one was necessary. The question isn't whether I was good enough to advance here. It's whether you were competent enough to recognize talent when it was literally working in front of you every night for 18 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that room was processing the complete inversion of everything they'd believed about competence, hierarchy, and professional worth. The woman they'd dismissed as invisible furniture had just proven that she understood their business better than they did, had built something more successful than they could manage, and had been watching their failures with the kind of strategic awareness they'd never achieved. The revelation was complete, but the consequences were just beginning. The immediate aftermath unfolded like a slow-motion explosion, with each person in the boardroom processing the revelation at their own pace, while the fundamental reality of their situation settled into their consciousness like poison seeping through their professional identities. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in a corporate setting, before the defensive reactions began cascading through the room in predictable waves. Blackstone was the first to break, his face cycling through shades of red as he struggled to maintain executive composure while his worldview crumbled around him. "This is unacceptable," he finally managed, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "You violated our trust, exploited your access to confidential information, and used your position to systematically undermine this company. We'll be filing lawsuits for breach of contract, theft of intellectual property, and corporate sabotage." I remained standing, my expression calm, as I watched him grasp for legal theories that wouldn't survive professional scrutiny. "Mr. Blackstone, I encourage you to contact your attorneys. They'll explain that observing your business practices while performing authorized janitorial duties doesn't constitute espionage, and that competing for clients in an open market isn't corporate sabotage. They'll also probably advise you that threatening litigation based on wounded pride tends to generate negative publicity that your company can't afford right now." Marcus jumped to his father's defense with the same thoughtless loyalty that had characterized his entire career. "You can't just waltz in here and act like you've accomplished something impressive. Building a consulting firm using insider knowledge from a position of trust isn't legitimate business success. It's cheating." The accusation hung in the air for a moment before Patricia Chen, the board member whose logistics industry experience gave her credibility that superseded family dynamics, responded with surgical precision. "Marcus, what insider knowledge? Ms. Santos has documented that her insights came from observing management failures that were visible to anyone paying attention. If anything, this presentation suggests that American Dynamics leadership wasn't paying enough attention to their own operational deficiencies." Morrison was taking notes frantically, clearly recognizing that the board would need comprehensive documentation of this meeting for both legal protection and strategic planning purposes. Her analytical mind was working through implications even as her personal shock continued processing. "Maria. Ms. Santos, the efficiency improvements you implemented for our former clients, those were based on observations you made here?" "Primarily," I confirmed, clicking back to a slide that showed side-by-side comparisons of American Dynamics operational processes versus MS Enterprises implementations for the same types of clients. "Your company provided an excellent case study in how not to manage supply chain operations. Every inefficiency I observed here became a competitive advantage when I designed better systems for your former clients." Another board member, James Rodriguez, who I recognized from industry publications as a veteran logistics executive, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Ms. Santos, can you quantify the operational improvements you achieved for companies that switched from American Dynamics to MS Enterprises?" I had prepared extensively for this question because I knew the numbers would be the most damaging evidence of American Dynamics management failures. Piedmont Industrial saw a 35% reduction in inventory carrying costs and 40% improvement in on-time deliveries within 90 days of switching. Atlantic Components achieved 28% cost savings and eliminated the chronic supply chain disruptions that had been affecting their production schedules. Southeastern Manufacturing improved their operational efficiency by 42%, while reducing logistics costs by $380,000 annually. Each statistic landed like a physical blow to Blackstone and Marcus, who were watching quantified proof that their former clients were thriving under management they'd dismissed as impossible or unnecessary. The improvements weren't marginal gains that could be attributed to market conditions or timing. They were transformational results that demonstrated fundamental differences in operational competence. Rodriguez continued his questioning with the systematic approach of someone conducting due diligence. And these improvements were achieved using methodologies that American Dynamics had access to but chose not to implement? In many cases, yes, I replied, pulling up documentation that made this point devastatingly clear. Jenny Walsh proposed process improvements that would have prevented the client service failures that led to contract terminations. David Chen designed analytical frameworks that would have identified the market opportunities your competitors captured. Sarah Martinez recommended client service adaptations that would have retained accounts worth millions in annual revenue. Morrison looked up from her notes with obvious pain in her expression. We dismissed those recommendations because we thought they were beyond the scope of their positions. You dismissed them because you assumed that expertise couldn't exist outside your established hierarchy, I corrected. The same assumption that led you to overlook the strategic intelligence you could have gained from treating your janitorial staff as human beings with backgrounds and capabilities rather than invisible furniture. The conversation was interrupted when Blackstone's assistant knocked on the conference room door and entered with obvious urgency. Mr. Blackstone, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter from the Atlanta Business Chronicle on the phone. She's asking for a comment on a story about American Dynamics and management practices in the consulting industry. The blood drained from Blackstone's face as he realized that the revelation in this boardroom was about to become public knowledge. Tell her we have no comment and refer her to our legal department. Actually, Patricia Chen interjected, we should probably take that call. If there's going to be media coverage of this situation, the board needs to understand what's being reported and ensure our response is appropriate. I felt a surge of satisfaction as the final element of my strategic plan activated. That would be Patricia Williams. I believe she's been investigating American Dynamics talent retention issues and client satisfaction problems as part of a broader story about management practices in traditional consulting firms. Blackstone stared at me with a mixture of horror and grudging recognition. You coordinated media coverage of this ambush? I provided factual information to a business journalist who was already investigating industry trends that American Dynamics exemplifies, I clarified. The story was always going to be written. I just made sure it would be accurate and comprehensive. Marcus looked like he was about to hyperventilate. This is a coordinated attack designed to destroy our company's reputation. You're using media manipulation and public humiliation to get revenge for imagined slights. Rodriguez, who had been quietly reviewing the documentation I'd provided, looked up with an expression that suggested his patience with the Blackstone family's defensive reactions was exhausted. Marcus, nothing in this presentation suggests imagined slights. Ms. Santos has documented systematic management failures that resulted in measurable losses of talent and revenue. The fact that she was in a position to observe these failures while being ignored by leadership makes the story more compelling, not less legitimate. Another board member, Dr. Sandra Kim, spoke for the first time since I'd begun the presentation. Ms. Santos, from a governance perspective, what would you recommend that American Dynamics do to address the operational and cultural issues you've identified? The question caught everyone off guard, including me. Dr. Kim was essentially asking the woman they'd employed as a janitor to provide strategic consulting advice to fix the company that had dismissed her expertise. The irony was so complete it felt almost fictional. Honestly, I replied, I think American Dynamics' problems are cultural rather than operational. The specific inefficiencies I documented are symptoms of leadership that prioritizes hierarchy over competence and position over performance. Those cultural issues are typically terminal in competitive markets because they prevent organizations from adapting to changing conditions or utilizing available talent effectively. Morrison set down her pen and looked directly at me. Are you saying the company can't be salvaged? I'm saying that meaningful change would require leadership that values results over relationships, expertise over experience, and adaptability over tradition. Based on 18 months of observation, I don't believe American Dynamics' current leadership team has the intellectual flexibility or professional humility to implement that kind of transformation. The assessment hung in the air like a diagnosis that everyone recognized as accurate, but no one wanted to accept. The board members were clearly processing implications that extended far beyond this single meeting, while Blackstone and Marcus struggled with the reality that their professional competence was being questioned by someone they'd literally paid to clean their toilets. The immediate aftermath was far from over, but the power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently and irreversibly. The woman they'd dismissed as invisible had just demonstrated that she'd been the most strategically aware person in their building for 18 months, and that their assumptions about competence, hierarchy, and professional worth were not just wrong but catastrophically dangerous to their business survival. The real consequences were just beginning to unfold. The broader consequences began manifesting within hours of the boardroom revelation, as news of Maria Santos's corporate identity spread through Atlanta's business community with the velocity that only comes from stories that challenge fundamental assumptions about power, competence, and professional recognition. The initial ripple effects were immediate and devastating to American Dynamics' remaining credibility. Patricia Williams' article in the Atlanta Business Chronicle was published at 2:47 p.m. that same Tuesday, less than 4 hours after I left the American Dynamics boardroom. The headline read, "From Janitor to CEO, How Corporate Blindness Created Its Own Competition," and the subheading delivered the killing blow. American Dynamics' former cleaning staff built the consulting firm that's capturing their market share. Williams had done her research thoroughly, interviewing former employees, industry analysts, and business school professors who provided context about the broader implications of what she was documenting. The article wasn't just about American Dynamics' failures. It was about systemic issues in corporate culture that prevented organizations from recognizing talent and utilizing human resources effectively. The story went viral on professional social media platforms within 6 hours of publication. LinkedIn posts sharing the article generated thousands of comments from professionals sharing their own experiences with workplace invisibility, management incompetence, and talent misrecognition. Twitter discussions expanded the conversation to include systemic issues around veterans' transition challenges, women in leadership, and class-based assumptions in corporate environments. But the most damaging coverage came from industry-specific publications that understood the technical implications of what MS Enterprises had achieved. Supply Chain Management Review published an analysis that examined how my company's innovations were transforming logistics consulting practices. The article positioned American Dynamics as an example of traditional firms that were becoming obsolete due to their inability to adapt to changing client expectations and technological capabilities. American Dynamics' corporate communications team attempted damage control through press releases that emphasized their company's stability, established relationships, and institutional knowledge. But their defensive messaging only reinforced the narrative that they were out of touch with modern business realities and unable to respond effectively to competitive challenges. The real devastation came when clients began commenting publicly about their experiences with both companies. Piedmont Industrial's CEO gave an interview to Manufacturing Today, in which he described his company's transformation under MS Enterprises management. The difference wasn't just operational efficiency. It was working with consultants who understood our business from the ground up, rather than applying template solutions that ignored our specific challenges. Atlantic Components Operations Director was even more direct in her assessment. American Dynamics treated us like we should be grateful for adequate service. MS Enterprises delivered results we didn't even know were possible. The choice was obvious once we saw what competent logistics consulting actually looked like. These testimonials weren't just client satisfaction stories. They were indictments of American Dynamics' entire service philosophy delivered by companies that had paid significant fees for substandard results. Each quote reinforced the narrative that established consulting firms were failing clients who deserved better, and that innovative approaches were available from competitors who understood modern business requirements. The employment marketplace responded immediately to the publicity surrounding my story. Within 48 hours of the Chronicle article's publication, MS Enterprises received over 200 unsolicited resumes from logistics professionals, many of whom specifically mentioned wanting to work for a company that valued competence over credentials and results over relationships. More significantly, I received contact from venture capital firms and private equity groups interested in discussing expansion opportunities for MS Enterprises. The publicity had positioned my company as a disruptive force in traditional consulting markets, exactly the kind of narrative that attracted investment capital looking for scalable business models with proven track records. American Dynamics faced the opposite dynamic. Their stock price dropped 12% in 2 trading days as investors processed the implications of systematic client losses and management failures documented in my presentation. The board's emergency meeting on Thursday resulted in Blackstone's resignation as CEO, though he retained his position as chairman, a compromise that satisfied no one and suggested continued governance dysfunction. Marcus was demoted from his executive vice president role to a senior analyst position, effectively ending his trajectory toward family succession. The board's official statement described this as reorganization to better utilize available talent and improve operational efficiency. But industry observers interpreted it correctly as punishment for the public embarrassment his comments had caused during my boardroom presentation. Morrison was promoted to interim CEO, a decision that was both overdue and insufficient given the cultural transformation American Dynamics needed to survive. Her first executive decisions included implementing the process improvements that Jenny Walsh had proposed months earlier, changes that might have prevented their client defections if they'd been adopted when originally suggested. But the most significant consequence was the systematic talent hemorrhage that accelerated after my revelation became public. American Dynamics lost 6 more employees within 2 weeks, including their facilities manager, 2 senior analysts, and their director of client relations. Each departure weakened their operational capacity while strengthening competitors who were actively recruiting from their depleted workforce. The facilities manager, Robert Martinez, had worked for American Dynamics for 8 years and understood their operational infrastructure better than anyone in leadership. His resignation letter, which was leaked to industry publications, included a paragraph that summarized the broader significance of what was happening. Management's failure to recognize Maria Santos's capabilities while she worked here demonstrates a cultural blindness that makes this organization unsurvivable for competent professionals who value respect and opportunity. Martinez joined MS Enterprises as our Director of Operations, bringing institutional knowledge about American Dynamics' continuing vulnerabilities that informed our competitive strategy going forward. His insider perspective helped us anticipate their responses to market challenges and position our services to capture additional market share from clients who were reconsidering their consulting relationships. The legal consequences were equally damaging to American Dynamics' position. Their threatened litigation against me never materialized because their attorneys recognized that my documentation was comprehensive, my methods were legal, and any court proceedings would generate additional negative publicity while validating my characterization of their management practices. Instead, they faced potential lawsuits from shareholders who claimed that management's failure to utilize available talent and retain clients constituted breach of fiduciary duty. The board was forced to hire external consultants to assess their governance practices and recommend structural changes, an expensive admission that their current leadership was inadequate for their business challenges. Industry associations began using American Dynamics as a case study in business schools and professional development programs. The Harvard Business Review published an analysis titled "When Hierarchy Blinds: How Status-Based Decision-Making Creates Competitive Vulnerabilities" that examined my story as an example of systemic corporate dysfunction. The article positioned my success as evidence that traditional corporate structures were failing to identify and utilize talent effectively, creating opportunities for more innovative competitors who could recognize capabilities regardless of their packaging. American Dynamics became synonymous with organizational obsolescence in academic discussions about leadership, human resources, and competitive strategy. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the transformation of industry attitudes toward veterans, working-class professionals, and unconventional career paths. My story became a touchstone for discussions about talent recognition, workplace inclusion, and the business value of diverse perspectives. Speaking invitations began arriving from professional associations, business schools, and corporate leadership conferences. The same expertise that American Dynamics had dismissed as irrelevant was now in demand from organizations that wanted to understand how to avoid the competitive blindness that had destroyed their former employer's market position. The broader consequences extended far beyond American Dynamics' corporate headquarters. An entire industry was grappling with questions about how talent gets recognized, how expertise gets utilized, and how traditional hierarchies might be preventing organizations from achieving their potential. My revelation had become a catalyst for conversations that were long overdue in corporate America. The reckoning was comprehensive, systematic, and irreversible. American Dynamics would continue operating, but their reputation, talent base, and market position had been permanently damaged by their own assumptions about competence and worth. The consequences weren't just professional, they were educational, forcing an entire industry to confront the dangerous blindness that comes from confusing position with capability. 6 months after the boardroom revelation that changed everything, I stood in the conference room of MS Enterprises' new headquarters in downtown Atlanta, looking out at a view that included American Dynamics' office building 12 blocks away. The contrast between our two organizations had become a case study in how quickly corporate fortunes can reverse when competence replaces complacency as the driving force behind business decisions. MS Enterprises had grown from a single founder consultancy to a 50-employee firm with contracts across the Southeast. The team that surrounded me now included Jenny Walsh as our Director of Process Innovation, David Chen leading our Analytics Division, Sarah Martinez managing Client Experience, and Robert Martinez overseeing Operations. Each of them brought expertise that American Dynamics had systematically undervalued, and each had become instrumental in building something better than what we'd left behind. The military precision that had shaped my leadership style in Afghanistan now informed our corporate culture in ways that created competitive advantages traditional consulting firms couldn't match. We operated with mission clarity, individual accountability, and adaptive problem-solving that turned client challenges into opportunities for innovation rather than excuses for incrementally improved inadequacy. Our client roster had expanded beyond former American Dynamics accounts to include Fortune 500 companies that had heard about our results and wanted to experience what competent logistics consulting actually looked like. General Motors contracted us to redesign their southeastern supply chain architecture. Home Depot retained us to optimize their distribution center operations. Delta Airlines hired us to streamline their cargo logistics across 3 major hubs. But the most satisfying client relationship was with the Department of Defense, which had awarded MS Enterprises a contract to provide logistics consulting for military supply chain optimization. My military background and proven private sector results made us uniquely qualified to understand both operational requirements and bureaucratic realities. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same competencies American Dynamics had dismissed as irrelevant were now being utilized to improve the efficiency of military operations that protected national security. American Dynamics had stabilized under Morrison's leadership, but stabilization wasn't the same as recovery. Their revenue had plateaued at roughly 60% of pre-revelation levels. Their talent retention remained problematic, and their reputation in the industry carried permanent scars from the publicity surrounding their management failures. They'd implemented reforms that addressed some operational inefficiencies, but the cultural transformation required for genuine competitiveness remained elusive. Morrison had reached out to me 3 months after the boardroom confrontation, ostensibly to discuss potential collaboration between our firms, but actually to understand how MS Enterprises had achieved results that continued eluding American Dynamics despite their reform efforts. The conversation was cordial, but revealed the fundamental limitation that prevented their recovery. They were still trying to solve 21st-century business challenges using 20th-century assumptions about hierarchy, expertise, and organizational effectiveness. "Maria," she'd said during our coffee meeting, "I understand why you did what you did. The company wasn't utilizing your capabilities, and you found ways to prove your worth outside our structure. But I'm curious about how you maintain quality control and client satisfaction with such rapid growth. Traditional consulting firms spend years developing institutional knowledge and systematic approaches." Her question revealed the persistent belief that success required complex institutional structures rather than competent people empowered to solve problems creatively. MS Enterprises succeeded precisely because we avoided the bureaucratic overhead that traditional firms mistook for professionalism. Our systematic approach was based on results rather than procedures, adaptability rather than rigid protocols, and individual expertise rather than institutional hierarchy. Helena, I'd replied, institutional knowledge is only valuable if it produces better outcomes than individual competence applied systematically. Your institutional knowledge included assumptions about talent recognition and resource utilization that created the vulnerabilities we exploited. Our systematic approach is simpler: hire competent people, give them clear objectives, provide necessary resources, and hold them accountable for results. The broader industry transformation continued accelerating as other firms recognized that the old model of consulting was becoming obsolete. Traditional partnerships were losing market share to boutique firms that offered specialized expertise and customized solutions. Corporate clients were demanding results rather than relationships, innovation rather than incrementally improved standardization. My story had become a catalyst for conversations about veteran employment that extended far beyond logistics consulting. Speaking engagements at business schools, veteran organizations, and corporate diversity conferences provided platforms to discuss how military experience translated into civilian business competencies that traditional hiring practices often failed to recognize. The Department of Veterans Affairs invited me to join their Veteran Employment Advisory Committee, where my experience became part of policy discussions about reducing veteran underemployment and improving corporate veteran recruitment practices. The same capabilities that American Dynamics had dismissed were now informing federal policy initiatives designed to help other veterans avoid similar professional invisibility. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I felt fully integrated. Not compartmentalized between military identity and civilian career, not split between professional competence and social invisibility, not forced to choose between authentic self-expression and workplace acceptance. MS Enterprises had become a place where my complete background was valued rather than tolerated, where military precision enhanced rather than threatened civilian teamwork. The nightmares that had plagued my early civilian transition had largely subsided, replaced by dreams about expansion plans, client innovations, and the continuing growth of something built on foundations of competence rather than connections. The hypervigilance that had made normal social interactions feel tactical had evolved into strategic awareness that enhanced, rather than hindered, professional relationships. American Dynamics still operated 12 blocks away, a daily reminder of assumptions that nearly succeeded in convincing me that my ceiling was other people's floors. Blackstone had officially retired, though rumors suggested his departure wasn't entirely voluntary. Marcus had left the consulting industry entirely, taking a position with his father-in-law's commercial real estate firm, where family connections might prove more durable than performance expectations. The lessons learned from 18 months of being invisible had become the foundation of leadership principles that informed every hiring decision, promotion consideration, and client interaction at MS Enterprises. Never assume that competence looks like what you expect. Never dismiss expertise because it comes packaged differently than your preferences. Never underestimate people whose circumstances don't reflect their capabilities. Those principles attracted talent that other firms overlooked and developed capabilities that traditional competitors couldn't match. Our success wasn't just business achievement. It was proof that alternative approaches to human resource utilization could create competitive advantages in markets where established players had become complacent about their assumptions. The frame they'd tried to construct around my possibilities had been shattered completely, replaced by horizons that expanded with each new challenge successfully addressed. But more importantly, MS Enterprises had become a place where other people could shatter frames that limited their potential, where military veterans could transition successfully into civilian leadership, where working-class backgrounds enhanced rather than hindered professional advancement. The woman who'd cleaned their offices while building their competition had become the CEO of their primary threat. But the real victory wasn't personal vindication. It was creating something that proved competence matters more than credentials, results matter more than relationships, and talent exists in places that traditional power structures refuse to look. The reckoning was complete, but the building had just begun. 5 years later, I received an invitation that brought the story full circle. American Dynamics had been acquired by a larger consulting firm, their brand quietly absorbed into corporate history. The building where I'd once cleaned offices now housed MS Enterprises' expanded operations. We'd purchased it at auction and converted the executive floor into a training center for veteran entrepreneurs. The invitation was to speak at Blackstone's granddaughter's college graduation. She'd written her senior thesis on corporate leadership failures, using her grandfather's company as a case study. Her research had led her to MS Enterprises and eventually to me. "Miss Santos," she said when we met, "I wanted to thank you. Not for what happened to my grandfather's company, but for showing me that competence can come from anywhere. Your story changed how I think about leadership, respect, and who deserves to be heard." She'd enlisted in the Army and planned to study business after her service. "I want to build something that sees people for who they are, not where they started." Standing in that same conference room where I'd once been invisible, now mentoring the granddaughter of the man who dismissed me, I realized the most beautiful victory wasn't revenge. It was transformation. Not just of companies or careers, but of how an entire generation would think about talent, respect, and possibility. The frame they'd tried to build around me hadn't just been shattered. It had been replaced by something bigger, something that made space for people like us to build the futures we deserved. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated? What would you have done in my situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your story matters, and sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to stay invisible. Thanks for watching, and remember, the people they overlook today might be the ones reshaping their world tomorrow.